The spotlight froze on the stage. 18-0 people watching a man with a trumpet, his face lit up with that famous smile, the one everyone in the world recognized. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the sound coming from that horn had started in the last place anyone would expect. Not in a music hall, not in a jazz club, not even in a loving home filled with encouragement and opportunity. It started in a cell, behind locked doors. In a place where childhood ended and survival began. And the story of how a single instrument transformed a boy's life would become one of the most powerful reminders that sometimes our darkest moments carry the seeds of our greatest light. New Orleans, 1912, New Year's Eve. The air was thick with smoke and celebration, with gunfire and laughter mixing in the streets like they belonged. Together, in the poorest neighborhoods where survival was a daily negotiation, the new year arrived not with champagne and hope, but with noise and chaos and a desperate kind of joy that came from still being alive to see another year. Louis Armstrong was 11 years old, small for his age, skinny, wearing clothes that had been worn by too many people before him. He lived with his mother and younger sister in a neighborhood where most kids his age had already learned that the world was not designed for their success. But Louis had something many of them didn't. A fierce determination that looked like trouble to most adults but was actually a survival instinct disguised as recklessness. That night, like most nights, Louis was out on the streets with the other boys from his block. They had found a pistol, an old .38 caliber revolver that someone had dropped, or abandoned or sold for almost nothing. It was loaded, and in the mind of an 11-year-old boy who had never known safety, who had grown up watching violence as casually as other children watched parades, the gun felt like power. When midnight approached, the neighborhood exploded with sound. People firing weapons into the air, shouting, celebrating the death of one year and the birth of another. Louis, caught up in the moment, aimed the pistol toward the sky and pulled the trigger. 6 shots. The sound was louder than he expected, the recoil stronger. And then, almost immediately, a hand on his shoulder. A police officer, white, broad, looking down at this tiny black child holding a weapon like it was a toy. Louis was arrested on the spot. No questions about why a child had a gun, no inquiry into where his parents were or what circumstances had led to this moment, just handcuffs that were too big for his small wrists and a police wagon that smelled like fear and urine. His mother, Mayanne, was found hours later, frantic and helpless. She had no money for bail, no connections to anyone with power, no ability to fight a system that had already decided her son's fate. Louis spent that night in a holding cell, crying silently so the other prisoners wouldn't hear. He was 11 years old and had just learned what it meant to be powerless. The next morning, a judge sentenced him to the Colored Waifs Home for boys, a reform school on the outskirts of New Orleans. It was described as a place of rehabilitation and education, but Louis knew what it really was: a prison for children, a place where boys who had made mistakes or simply been born into the wrong circumstances were sent to be forgotten. The doors of the waif's home closed behind him with a finality that felt like the end of something. He didn't know yet that it was actually a beginning, the most unlikely, unexpected, transformative beginning of his entire life. The Colored Waifs Home was run by Captain Joseph Jones and his wife, strict disciplinarians who believed in order, routine, and the kind of harsh structure that broke some children and shaped others. Louis arrived terrified and angry, a combination that made him difficult in ways the staff recognized immediately. He fought with other boys. He refused to follow rules. He carried his street survival instincts into a place where they didn't serve him, and for the first weeks he seemed destined to become one of the lost ones. The boys who aged out of the home with no skills, no hope, and a deepened bitterness that would follow them forever. But there was someone at the Waifs home who saw something different in Louis. Peter Davis, the music instructor, a black man in his 30s who had grown up in similar circumstances and understood that music could be the difference between a life wasted and a life transformed. Davis ran the home's brass band, a ragtag group of boys with donated instruments who played at community events and local parades. He noticed Louis immediately, not because of his behavior, but because of something else: the way Louis listened when music was playing, the way his body responded to rhythm even when he was trying to appear indifferent, the way his eyes tracked the instruments like they were something sacred. Davis approached Louis after a particularly bad incident where Louis had been caught fighting in the yard. Instead of punishment, Davis made an offer. "You want to play in the band?" Louis looked at him with suspicion. He had never touched an instrument in his life. Music was something he heard in the streets, in the churches, in the brothels where his mother sometimes worked. It was background noise to survival, not something a boy like him could actually create. But something in Davis's voice suggested this wasn't charity. It was opportunity disguised as discipline. You follow the rules, you practice, you work harder than you've ever worked at anything, and I'll teach you, Davis said. But if you mess up, if you disrespect the music or the other boys, you're done. Understood? Louis nodded, not because he understood the significance of the moment, but because it felt like the first time an adult had offered him something instead of taking something away. The first instrument Davis handed him was a tambourine, not even close to the trumpet Louis would eventually become famous for. Just a simple percussion instrument used to teach rhythm and timing. Louis hated it. It felt like an insult, like being given the least important role in something that was supposed to matter. But Davis was firm. Everyone starts at the bottom, he said. You earn your way to the horn. So Louis played the tambourine. He played it in practice sessions and at local performances where the band marched through neighborhoods, drawing crowds of people who applauded not because the music was particularly good, but because these were children trying to build something in a world designed to tear them down. Months passed. Louis proved himself reliable, disciplined, and unexpectedly passionate about learning. Other boys quit or got expelled, but Louis stayed. He watched the trumpet players with an intensity that Davis noticed but didn't comment on yet. The trumpet was the lead instrument, the one that carried melodies and demanded technical skill and confidence. It was the instrument that required you to breathe your soul into metal and produce something that moved people. And Louis wanted it with a desperation he couldn't articulate, not because it looked impressive, not because it would make him special, but because somewhere deep inside, he sensed that the trumpet could give voice to something inside him that had never had language before. One afternoon in 1913, after Louis had been at the Waifs' home for over a year, Peter Davis called him into the music room. On the table sat an old, battered cornet, not even a trumpet, but its smaller, mellower cousin. Brass was tarnished, the valves sticky, the mouthpiece dented from years of use by boys who had come before. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't new, but to Louis Armstrong in that moment it was the most precious thing he'd ever seen. You've earned this, Davis said simply. Now let's see what you can do with it. Louis picked up the cornet with trembling hands. The metal was cool against his palms, heavier than he expected. Davis showed him how to hold it, how to position his lips against the mouthpiece, how to use his breath to create sound instead of just noise. The first attempts were terrible. Broken squeaks and gasping air and frustration that made Louis want to throw the instrument across the room. But Davis was patient in a way Louis had never experienced before. Again, he'd say quietly, feel it, don't force it, let the air do the work, and slowly, painfully, note by note, Louis began to understand. The cornet wasn't something you fought, it was something you collaborated with. You gave it breath and it gave you voice. The first clean note Louis produced on that cornet changed something fundamental inside him. It wasn't just sound, it was proof that he could create something beautiful in a world that had only ever shown him ugliness. Proof that his breath, his body, his intention could be transformed into something that moved through the air and touched other people. He practiced obsessively. While other boys were playing cards or sleeping, Louis was in the music room running through scales until his lips were raw and his arms ached from holding the instrument. Peter Davis would find him there late at night, working through exercises by lamplight, and instead of sending him to bed, Davis would sit and listen, offering corrections and encouragement in equal measure. What Louis discovered in those months was that music gave him something he'd never had: control. In a life where everything had been decided for him, where poverty and race and circumstance had dictated his options, the cornet responded only to his choices. If he practiced, he improved. If he listened, he learned. If he put his emotion into the notes, people felt it. That cause and effect, that direct relationship between effort and result, was revolutionary for a boy who had grown up believing the world was random and cruel. Music was the first thing in his life that made sense, the first thing that rewarded him for trying. The Waifs' Home brass band began to change with Louis in it, what had been a competent but unremarkable group of boys playing simple marches became something more. Louis brought an energy to his performances that went beyond technical skill. He played like the music mattered, like every note was a statement of worth in a world that had declared him worthless. People in the neighborhoods where the band performed started to notice. They'd ask, "Who's that boy on the cornet?" They'd request songs just to hear Louis take the lead. And slowly, word began to spread about a kid at the Waifs' home who could make a beaten-up cornet sound like hope itself. But the real transformation wasn't happening in the performances. It was happening inside Louis. The anger that had defined him when he first arrived at the Waifs' home was being redirected into something productive. The pain of his childhood, the abandonment, the poverty, the night he was arrested, all of it was finding expression through the instrument instead of through violence or self-destruction. Music became his language for everything he couldn't say with words, and Peter Davis, watching this transformation, understood that he wasn't just teaching a boy to play an instrument. He was giving that boy a lifeline, a way to survive not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually in a world that would continue to be hostile and unfair. Louis was released from the Colored Waifs Home in 1914 after serving approximately 18 months. He was 13 years old, returning to the same poverty and chaos he'd left, but carrying something now that changed everything. That battered cornet which Peter Davis had allowed him to keep, and more importantly, the knowledge that he had a gift, a purpose, a reason to keep going even when everything else suggested there was no point. He returned to his mother's tiny apartment, back to streets filled with the same dangers and temptations, but now music was his anchor. He started playing wherever anyone would listen. Street corners, honky-tonks, riverboats, funeral processions. Any opportunity to play meant an opportunity to improve, to be heard, to earn a few coins that could help his family survive. The New Orleans music scene in the 1910s was a chaotic, vibrant, cutthroat world where jazz was being invented in real time by musicians who didn't even know they were creating something that would change global culture. Louis learned from everyone. The older players who could make instruments speak in ways that seemed impossible. The street musicians who played with raw emotional honesty. The church organists who understood harmony and soul. He absorbed it all, synthesized it into something uniquely his own, and practiced until his lips bled and his fingers cramped. And slowly, inevitably, people began to recognize that Louis Armstrong wasn't just another kid trying to make it in music. He was something special. By his late teens, Louis was playing with some of the best musicians in New Orleans. By his 20s, he was being recruited by bands in Chicago and New York. By his 30s, he was recording albums that would define jazz for generations. The small boy who had been arrested on New Year's Eve with a pistol became the man whose trumpet could make 18-0 people cry with joy. The child who had spent months in a reform school became the artist who would be loved worldwide, whose music would transcend race and class and geography. But Lou never forgot where it started. He never forgot Peter Davis, the man who had given him that first cornet and taught him that discipline and practice could transform pain into beauty. In interviews later in life, when Louis Armstrong was famous beyond measure, he would always mention the Waifs' home. Not with bitterness, not with shame, but with gratitude. "That's where I learned to play," he'd say. "That's where everything began." He understood something profound that many people never grasp. That sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways. That sometimes being forced into circumstances we'd never choose leads us to discoveries we'd never make otherwise. The pistol that got Louis arrested was an instrument of violence. The cornet that Peter Davis gave him was an instrument of creation. And the choice between those two instruments, between destruction and beauty, between rage and art, defined not just Louis Armstrong's life, but his legacy. Because what he proved, more powerfully than almost any artist before or since, was that your beginning doesn't determine your ending. That being born into poverty and chaos and structural injustice doesn't mean you're destined to stay there. That talent combined with discipline, opportunity combined with determination, can create transformations that seem impossible until they happen. Today, millions of people know Louis Armstrong's music. They know What a Wonderful World and Hello, Dolly, and that gravelly voice that could convey both joy and heartbreak in a single phrase. But most don't know about the locked doors that led to the open stage. Most don't know about Peter Davis and the Colored Waifs Home and a battered cornet that changed the trajectory of music history. Most don't know that the smile everyone recognizes was built on a foundation of resilience that came from surviving the kind of childhood that breaks most people. That's the real story of Louis Armstrong. Not just the music, though the music was extraordinary. Not just the fame, though the fame was well earned. The real story is about a boy who could have become another statistic, another lost child swallowed by poverty and systemic injustice, but instead became proof that redemption is possible. That creativity can flourish in the most unlikely soil. That sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you can redirect your life toward the best thing you'll ever become. And it all started with a trumpet that changed everything, or rather, a cornet, battered, old, barely functional, but in the hands of a boy who had been given one chance, one teacher who believed, one instrument that responded to breath and intention. That cornet became a voice that would echo through decades, across continents, into the hearts of people who would never know struggle like Louis had known it, but would recognize the truth in every note he played. The music didn't erase the pain, it never does, but it transformed the pain into something that could touch people, move people, remind people that beauty and suffering aren't opposites. They're partners in the creation of art that matters. Louis Armstrong understood that in a way few artists ever do. He understood that every note he played carried the weight of where he'd come from and the lightness of where music could take him. And that paradox, that beautiful tension between darkness and light, became the signature of everything he created. 18,000 people watching a man with a trumpet, his face lit up with that famous smile. They saw joy, they saw mastery, they saw a legend, but what they were really seeing, whether they knew it or not, was a miracle. The miracle of a boy who was given an instrument in a locked room and used it to unlock the entire world.